Hello and welcome to episode 23 of the Know-It-Alls. And this month's theme is Beyond Signatures. And 5 of us will be exploring what you can learn about your quilt beyond the signatures that may be on it. And that will be explored in various ways that you will soon see. So let's start with Barbara Brackman.
Well, I'm glad to start. I'm going to start my slideshow here. And I'm going to talk about what you can learn from the actual technique of the signature, not so much the content, but the technique. And I'm always interested in dating quilts. So I have a big file of quilts with the actual dates on them, beginning with this old Anna Toole's quilt from 1785, one of the earliest North American quilts, and going up until, actually I've been saving this up into the 80s. It's a scary file. But anyway, I looked at signatures last week just to see if they can be, the technique can be useful to us as well as the content. Now, one of the things I found is that, of course, and you probably would have guessed this, is that different styles of script, different styles of writing change with overtime. And so we're going to explore that a little bit. Go down here. The first thing we're going to look at is cross stitch. And that seems to be the standard. Anna Toole's mother, or Anna herself, appliqued those letters. But that's rather unusual that early. I'm not going to talk about that too much because it seems to span from 1780s up to 1990s. So, I mean, up to whatever the heck the date is today, up into the 20th century. So here's some cross stitches I have, and I dated, and some of them have just the date on the back of the quilt. Some of them have just the date on the front of the quilt. They range from 1804. Here we have someone who was very adept at this, from Nashville, Tennessee. And we have determined before that she is probably from Connecticut originally, but that woman could write a novel in cross stitch. And here we have the back of the quilt. And I'm showing you these because I want you to get a feel for how small these stitches are. Now they're called counted. I cannot imagine that people, I don't know, you guys are smarter than me, but does that look like she's counted the yarns in that linen or that very coarse cotton on the back of the quilt? Now, some people were so adept, as I said, they could write novels. Here's somebody who was a good mathematician, much better than us, who said she has 732,000 stitches in her quilt. I think she multiplied. And these are early. These are when you would expect to see a lot of cross stitch, but it continues into the into the 19th century. But it gets bigger. It does seem to get bigger. And it gets, here, have an art history background. It gets mannered, just a little bit stylized. It's not as functional or pragmatic as it was. And so the one we see down here in 1867, it's just not the same. But this is very subtle. Now, I have asked Lynne, our expert on the 18th century, why the heck did people have to torture themselves and learn to do this? Well, it's because they did. Also because they were marking. The cross stitch is called the marking stitch too. First of all, I'm going to get rid of this here. Get you down there so you can see what I got here. But never mind. But this is a sampler sort of thing. A beautiful little piece of needlework dated very early. And this is the kind of thing Mary Elizabeth would be taught to do in school. And it might be, the basis of the needlework curriculum. Why did they do this? Because it taught the girls to embroider, and also it was useful in keeping house because you had linens, which were very expensive as handmade, and you rotated them. Now I rotate my sheets, but I don't have numbers on them, but they did. And this was then their names are on them. And one reason is because they were community laundries. You It would, can you imagine washing sheets by hand once a year, and they were linen, and the ironing. But anyway, if you had a woman, a laundress, they might have gone to a community laundry and they would be returned to you. Some people say it's because people stole sheets too. And you see a lot of that in the newspapers, stolen 2 sheets. But I'm going to focus a little bit on this page because I want you to see one of the flaws in my system of dating quilts is that I rely on the date on the quilt. It has to, most of the time, I really like it to be on the quilt rather than an attached label, but it's on the front or the back. But the ones on the back worry me. And here you see a woman named Kezia. I don't know how you pronounce Kezia. She was a slave owner, I think, in South Carolina. And she writes in her journal that she gave Mary, one of her enslaved people, a sheet to use for quilt lining. And the person who transcribed this diary left off the number 1. It said, in the transcription, it says made in 1842, no for a quilt lining. Well, that didn't make any sense. So I went back and looked because I knew there would be a number there. You numbered your sheets. Now, I don't see anybody numbering them into the 27 or anything. They mostly are 3s and 4s. But once the sheet was worn, maybe on the edges, you might recycle it as Kezia did. She gave it to Mary to use for quilt lining. So my date, what if this, here we have, this is on the back of a quilt. 1840 number 2, that was a sheet. The quilt might have been made in 1880. So that's the basic flaw in my system is when I'm using these cross stitch. So I'm just telling you this to sort of remind you that the cross stitch had a function as well as beauty. So we're going to go to the next one. Well, you continue to see it through the 19th century, but it gets more mannered. And this is one over here. We're going to look at each one. 1866 Confederate memorial, and it's just not the same function. This is a woman who could cross stitch and probably write a novel on it, recording Confederate generals. And she seems to have been quite skillful at it. Then you start seeing less skill. This one from 1890, that is not counted over the threads of the linen. But this one, this one, 1891, this woman was pretty darn good at it. But then look again, she was born in 1818. So when she was 10 in 1848, she was going to schools that taught the marking stitch. Things get stranger. Jenny Boyd is using canvas, heavy, some kind of a heavy cotton. It's much easier to count the bigger the thread. And then we get into sort of this stylized embroidery nostalgia in the 20th century. And I've got 2 dates here, with roses and flowers, and this is no longer counted. And this, they're beautiful, but it's part of the colonial revival, I think, where in the early 20th century, people really wanted to echo those antique quilts. Another technique that you see commonly is inking. And we're going to see the same thing in inking where there's a skill and then they lose the skill. Sometimes the skill comes back. But these are some of the early inkings. And that's surprising that the earliest Lynne that I've got is in the 1830s. And these are 2 very interesting inkings, very complex. That one's not skillfully done, but it's ambitious. And I think these are friends who have like Greek names as, a club or something. So there's some early inking. We have done a thing on inking. I think we've probably done several things on inking, but the technique really does seem to have occurred about 1840, and the ink was out there. People could either buy it made or make their own, which was a skill many, many people had. So you see some very complicated, we're talking about beyond the signature, very complicated, especially in the 40s and 50s. It was considered a real attribute to be able to ink. Now, not everybody can. I'm a good inker, especially with the Pigma pen and not that bottle of ink. But my friends always ask me to do the inking, and I'm glad to do it because I can't sew. So I'm glad to ink. And I wonder about this one down here in 1865. Mrs. Henrietta L. Hubener of Pennsylvania. Was William Gross? Is William the person she made the quilt for? Or did she hire William as a scribe to ink it for her? Because not only would you ask your friends for favors, as Debbie's going to probably tell you, you could hire someone who was a good inker. So in the 40s and 50s, you see this rather talented inking, except for this one, and very ambitious. And as I say, a good inker, whether you paid him or asked a favor, was a real talent in this album quilt craze. But things kind of start slipping. And one of the problems that you get is people were not only good at inking, they weren't good at writing. So we have here Anna Mary Rhodes. The woman is dyslexic. I'm a former reading teacher. I could have helped Anna if she'd gone to school for any length of time, and we would have drilled and drilled and drilled until she got those A's right. But you start seeing much more amateurness into the Civil War. And then after the war, it's a free-for-all. This is not the kind of inking that reflects so nicely on a woman who, or a man who is known for their skill in art. Although there are exceptions. This wonderful 1874 one with the dog and the lion. There's always exceptions of people who were good with their pen. But many people were not. And what the tendency I saw, this is in the inking, it goes into the 20th century, but it gets worse and worse. And it might be that the pens are worse. It might be that they're older. This is not only a great aunt making a quilt for Roy, a great, great aunt. And she's 85. And I bet she couldn't find a pen she liked. And her hand probably shook a little bit. So you really start seeing a deterioration in the inking, but you do see it into the 20th century. So when you're looking, for quilts that are not dated, think about that. It really isn't much of a clue. It's more the quality of the picture, of the handwriting, that is the clue. The really skillful stuff is 40s and 50s when it was considered a real attribute. And then we have what I call linear embroidery. This is the kind of embroidery I would do on a quilt. And here we have one of the earliest that I've found with the linear embroidery, Charlotte Rowe. This is in the Smithsonian. And as we go kind of counterclockwise here, Mary Reese, 1827. Is that accurate? I don't know. But she was pretty good at what she was doing. And you see it again in the 50s, 40s and 50s, when a good skillful hand name was considered an asset. And it goes on. This is very nicely done into the 80s. But things went down the tubes. And my theory is girls got an education in something besides hand embroidery and things, and they just weren't learning anymore, and nobody cared. The standards just went. And also we have the dyslexic, people who still were not good at writing. Now, Emily, that's the way I embroidered. I think it's supposed to be some kind of a chain stitch, but it's all scrabbed. And this woman, oh, no. But anyway, I have hundreds of these, which I will be glad to show you if you want to come over. And then this one, oh, that's bad. So things really took a dive. Bad embroidery, I would say, after the Civil War until about 1880. And then a new fad took place, this fashion for red work. I think what happened here is that girls were then again educated. They might have taken private lessons, or they just might have, trained themselves to do it. But it was very highly valued in the 80s and into the 90s. And you see it in crazy quilts too. But this is nice. Look at this one here in 1885, how beautifully she does that embroidery. Although things then, as the fad fades, things take another dive. 66 is not that old. She just never had any training. But we see this. These whole narratives here, not well done, but we're so glad they're there. I can't complain because I can't do any better myself. Now there's a couple of other blips in the fashion. This is something that I think is a very good clue to date, which is designer monograms. You know, magazines like Godey's, here's one, a very early one, were showing you what kind of art alphabets you could be doing from quite a while, but people were not putting these on quilts until the era of the crazy quilt. I don't see any quilts with that kind of a designer monogram before the era of the crazy quilts, was the 80s. So here are 3 or 4. This one, I love this one. Somebody designed that to be completely non-functional. It's there, 1896. So when you see these designer monograms, think crazy quilt era, 1880, maybe 1910, and then again, blip, everybody forgot how to do it. And it wasn't important to a woman in 1910 to have the beautiful embroidery stitch. Quilted inscriptions is the last I'm going to talk about. I did find a little bit of difference. I've seen it, you know, from about 1800. You have to remember that you don't get much white work until you have really a lot of access to white cotton thread. And that would be about 1800, 1810. So here's an early one, another one 10 years later, no, 3 years later. And the theme today is arithmetic. And the only thing I found is it goes up until recent past, but here's one from 1924. I've got them after the war. The writing seems reasonable, but what is missing in these 3 at the bottom is filler. They are not filled in behind, they're just quilted. And what's the difference between that maybe and linear embroidery? I don't know. So when you're looking for a date that's quilted, you might see more filler quilting before the Civil War than after. So that's all I have to say about it. We'll see how you guys are gonna, your perspective on looking at techniques.
Well, that was wonderful, Barbara. I learned a whole
thank you.
Yes.
I wanted to ask about the relationship between samplers and those early cross stitch, or counted stitch. You, I don't think you referred to.
I didn't show a real sampler, did I? Because I was too lazy. But there are, you know, there are hundreds and hundreds of them. That was what a girl brought home from school to show that her father paid and he got what he paid for. And they were, you know, that cross stitches definitely. I don't know a whole bunch about samplers, so that's one reason I didn't get into them.
One of my one of my favorite quilts that I deciphered with basically no information is a whole cloth quilt. I actually wrote about it for for blanket statements 20 years ago, almost, well, 25 years ago. But the sheet had been cross-stitched with the initials and the number, and then it was used as the backing on the quilt, and they didn't pick the stitches out until after it had been dyed for the backing, for the quilt backing. And so basically the number and the initials came up in resist.
Oh, cool.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that was one of my favorite things. I wanted to also point out that those pieces you showed where the cross stitch appeared on fabric that you really can't count the stitches on, they had waste canvas in the 19th century. So you could have a loosely woven piece of fabric laid over your fashion fabric and use that to count your stitches, and then you could pull the threads out.
I forgot
and you'd
about
have
that.
this beautiful even cross stitch on satin, which you can't count on satin.
No.
Very interesting.
And if I make one more thing,
Well, you're the expert.
I think
on these
one
early
more reason that the inked inscriptions got worse in the 19th century is that they were moving from goose quills to steel nib pens. Steel nib pens are a lot harder to do nice
what I was
delicate working with,
Yeah.
because they have no flexibility. And they
Hmm.
blot
When I
out.
was in art school, we had to do stuff with a steel nib pen and India ink, and it was tough. But I've never tried a goose quill. I didn't realize they were more flexible. But that's what I'm thinking in some of those people, that they were very upset with their pen, because if you read their letters, they're always upset with their pen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point.
that's true.
Well, I think it's time to move on to Lynn.
All right. I'm gonna-
Okie dokie. My talk is about one particular quilt that came with lots of labels, and so it's sort of kind of about our theme here. It's about digging deeper than what the label, what the names on it will tell you. So this quilt is America's earliest, that we know of so far, documented completed hexagon quilt. I had the privilege of researching and exhibiting this quilt at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in 2008. It was made in 1794 by Sarah Ewald Spencer of Bedford, Pennsylvania, and it came with loads of documentation, including other quilts from the family and even the blanket chests that they were kept in. Regardless, a previous curator had exhibited it and dated it to the 1840s. So the first step in judging the veracity of this or any quilt's documentation is to compare the stated history with the evidence of the object itself. And I talked earlier in an earlier know-it-alls about the idea that hexagon quilts didn't appear until after the development of the kaleidoscope, and debunked that idea. So I just want to tell you that this quilt from the 1790s is not the only hexagon quilt in America in the 1790s. I know of two others. There's one at the Newark Art Museum from 1793. So it's a little earlier than this one, but it's not finished. So this is the first finished one. And then there's another one that is still in the family. It was made by Sally Franklin Bache of Philadelphia, but I couldn't get permission to use the photos that I have of that one. So you're going to have to just trust me that they exist. However, there's loads of evidence of the hexagon mosaic being a common patchwork design in England in the 18th century. So let's compare Sarah Ewald's quilt with this one in the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum, so we can consider the accuracy of the 1794 date. So here we have that quilt and some of the loose patches, again, not finished. Just wanted to show you this wonderful printed plaid that appears on both of these quilts and compare it with the with this wonderful 18 teens dress in the collection of Old Sturbridge Village. Okay, so that's like 20 years later, but still, you know, we're kind of in the period. Lots of block prints, very consistent technology for the 1790s. Here we have prints dating even earlier than what are in the Spencer quilt. These dark brown ground fabrics are so common in the late 18th century. We see the pencil blue too. So again, technology is consistent. This little dotted floral print, it also is appropriate. I always try and show fabrics in comparison to costume, because costume is so easily dated. And here we have these blues, wonderful dress from about 1800 or so from the Colonial Williamsburg collection, again in the Victoria and Albert Museum, patchwork, and also in the Spencer quilt. So this quilt also came with information that the fringe was made by Madame de Lille in 1 year later in 1795. The identity of Madame de Lille is unknown. Pennsylvania drew many French expatriates in the 18th century, and the Spencers were intermarried with another French expatriate family by the name of Bonnet or Bonnet. This will come up later. Sarah and Robert even gave their daughter Anna the middle name Bonnet. And here's a Winterthur bed cover from the late 18th century that has very much the same sort of fringe. The quilt was scattered with paper labels giving the names of the people associated with the calico patches. It was probably the maker's great-grandson, George Ross Scull, who was born in 1855, who labeled the pieces in the quilt, documenting what may have been the family oral history. Unfortunately, most of the tags were removed without documentation at the time of its previous exhibition. So we no longer know which tag corresponds to which fabric, but at least they were saved in the quilt's document file in the registrar's office. These labels indicated scraps of dresses from family members and ancestors, including Sarah's own wedding dress from 1793, along with scraps of dresses from famous women of the day, including Mrs. General Lafayette. Can we believe this family history? First, we have to find out who Sarah Ewalt was, which in the 18th century means we have to start with the male members of her family. Sarah Ewalt was born in 1766, the daughter of Bavarian immigrant John Ewalt and Sarah Dunkley Ewalt. She married Robert Spencer, who was born in 1765, in 1793. Robert, who was also from Bedford Township, is listed in records as a gentleman. He was an innkeeper, surveyor, and contractor who built the first courthouse in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, completing it in 1802 for the sum of $5,600. Bedford is 200 miles west of Philadelphia, which was the capital of the United States in the early years of the country. Is it possible that Sarah Ewalt Spencer actually knew the famous women supposedly represented on her quilt? For one, Mrs. General Lafayette, otherwise known as Adrienne de Noailles, Marquise de Lafayette, never came to America, but her husband, who served in the American Revolution, was a general and aide to George Washington. Still, Lafayette was nowhere near Pennsylvania in 1794. Dolly Madison is another historical figure claimed by a tag removed from the quilt. She actually might be possible, as a 19th century publication of Dolly Madison's letters mentions her good friend Sarah Scull, with whom she attended Quaker meeting before her marriage to James Madison, also in 1794. While the Scull and Spencer families did not become related until the generation after this quilt was made, it's not impossible that there were connections through friendships in the 1790s. Mrs. Alexander Hamilton is also claimed by a tag. Alexander Hamilton was in Bedford in 1794 during the Whiskey Rebellion. He was definitely not popular in town because it was his policy of taxing whiskey that started the rebellion. Whiskey being more efficient to transport to markets than grain, and it was even used as a medium of exchange. But did his wife, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, come with him? No. She was in Philadelphia, pregnant and caring for her sick children, the stress of which perhaps contributed to her miscarriage that fall. So how did Sarah get a scrap of the unpopular Secretary of the Treasury's wife's dress? Another figure claimed by one of George Ross Scull's tags, whose husband was in town in 1794 for the Whiskey Rebellion, was Martha Washington. She was the quilt maker herself, as seen in 3 surviving quilts in Mount Vernon's collection. And it would be wonderful. It's my dream to bring this quilt together with those 3 quilts and compare scraps between them all. According to Wikipedia, the Espy House in Bedford is notable for having been the headquarters of George Washington and his force of 13,000 while putting down the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. The federal troops are believed to have assembled near the Jean Bonnet Tavern, just 4 miles west of Bedford. So remember that the Spencers were close friends with John Bonnet of that tavern. And so Washington was also familiar with the area, having encamped there during the French and Indian War. And so here are more of Martha Washington's quilts. Alden and I had the great pleasure of getting a behind the scenes tour in storage there at Mount Vernon in 2019. And there's a wonderful article about these quilts that you can find online by Amanda Isaacs. So just Google Martha Washington quilts, or we'll put it in our resources after this. One more from George Washington's family. Again, so interesting to compare the fabrics and understand how similar they are between all of these quilts. So other tags on this quilt list family members. So I've just listed them here, various and sundry family members, going back claiming to, there's a piece claimed to be from the great-great-great-great-grandmother Dunkley. And I can't figure out what the significance of these dates are, but the fabrics are definitely not of that date. Oh, shoot, I meant to look up his name. The author of the book of the oh shoot, sorry, the orphanage in England. Somebody help me pop up here.
John Stiles.
Thank you. John Stiles came and looked at this quilt with me. And he also confirms that all of these fabrics are from the late 18th century. So if these women died before, say, the 1780s, it's unlikely that any of their fabrics are in this quilt. So in conclusion, this quilt is a fantastic document of American family, local, and national history. The 1790s economy, the Whiskey Rebellion, and the establishment of the role of the federal government as seen through the lens of the colonial revival and an exaggerated sense of family history. It's proof that what we call granny tags, or in this case, grandpa tags, should be taken with a grain of salt. And that's what I've got for you.
The grain of salt.
Or a whiskey.
Yeah. Mm. Well, you know, I'm looking at that. As I can't even say this, I've never said it in my life before. Verisimilitude was not the hallmark of museum curation at the time. George Washington slept here, you know, and
or
that connection,
colonial revival in general.
Yeah, which is much later too. That connection was so important, and it was important in defining a myth and defining who we were. You know, we were not colonists from Spain and France, Africa, or Native Americans. We were Anglo-Saxons. And
one thing about this quilt that reminds me, if any of our viewers today watched the textile talk with the Quilt Alliance that a few of us did, where we were talking about labeling quilts, and Alden made the very good point that if you put an inked label on muslin or paper or anything like that onto your quilt, that you should remove it if for some reason that the quilt is washed. Although we all know that's to be avoided if possible. But anyway, here is a great example of putting it back on. You know, don't forget to put it back on.
Or at least mark a piece of paper, right?
Make a list.
Drawing,
Yeah. Make a list of where it goes.
Apparently these tags offended the appearance, how the curator felt this quilt should appear on exhibit, and so she took all the tags off, but didn't document which fabrics they came from. And certainly some of those fabrics could have been associated with the people that they were, you know, said to. Some of them are possible, but now it's impossible to pair them up again.
Really
So
is a shame.
at least document where it came off of.
Yeah, hard to believe.
It is hard to believe.
Well, next in our lineup is Debbie Cooney. And so I'm going to jump in here as host and hand it over to Debbie.
I'll mute myself here.
Okay. Well, this feathered star I found near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and it was supposed to be local. It's got nice, strong colors and it's quite graphic. But the selling point for me was the inscription, which is down here. And you will see right here. We have Catherine Newcomer, April the 23rd, 1840. I take Catherine to be the maker who finished the quilt. And in searching ancestry, you find a grave and other sites. No candidates with that name lived in Harrisburg or Dauphin County, but several turned up in nearby Pennsylvania counties. More were found in Maryland counties close to the Pennsylvania line, but that was stuck because I couldn't, Maryland, Pennsylvania, it's got kind of a Pennsylvania look. But that early, it's hard to say because Maryland and Pennsylvania styles are very similar in those days. But I contacted John Newcomer, who is from the family, a very large extended Newcomer family, and he looked at the quilt and told me that the Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania border area was the best bet. So I'll keep looking for more information because more information is posted on these sites all the time. And when you revisit them, you can find more information. This double star came from an estate sale in Waynesboro, Pennsylvania. It's really very nicely done with great quilting here, all around there. And it has a fringe on 3 sides. The location is right on the Mason-Dixon line, about 10 miles from Hagerstown, Maryland. The man's family tree, which was large, also had a lot of second marriages, and it was a challenge, but I tracked down most of these lines back to the early 19th century. Here is the signature here, March 6th, 1840. This was made by Elizabeth Shank. Elizabeth does not show up among any of this man's forebears, most of whom remained in the area. So they didn't move out, they didn't travel much to anywhere else. So where this came from, I'm still in the dark about. So I began to look for Elizabeth further afield, and 2 candidates lived nearby, but both of them were very well off. So it didn't seem likely that they were hired to make such a quilt, especially with this bold declaration of its origin. Elizabeth lives in surrounding counties, others of this name, but it was impossible to tell if they had any involvement. I had more luck with this quilt as names quickly appeared in Chester County, Pennsylvania, west of Philadelphia. The center turkey red block, presumably that of the recipient, was stamped Christian March. The only Christian I could find in that period of time lived in York County, about 70 miles distant. So that didn't seem right. But when I plotted out the connections, I realized that the center name had to be Christiane. The second N either was faded or had been missed when they stamped it. Every branch of Christiane's mother, Elizabeth's close kin, were present on this quilt, either aunts, uncles, or their children. Elizabeth had died in 1838, and Christiane's father, Nicholas, had married a widow, Sarah Lacey, in 1841. She brought 3 children to the union, including Daniel Lacey. And having lived in the same household with Elizabeth and Nicholas' daughter, Christiane, The two of them married in 1852. Now, the purpose of this quilt is, it strikes me that if it was from the early 1840s, which I'm not sure about, was perhaps sympathy for Christiane's mother's death. But if it was made closer to 1850, maybe it was a celebration of their upcoming marriage. And I think the union must have been approved because their pastor and his wife's wife both have blocks on the quilt. So the fact that they were stepbrother and sister didn't prevent them from being married. This quilt is one of the best signatures I've ever come across. It's elegant and inscribed and dated 1851. And such a variety of fabrics as these are common in Lebanon County, according to the expert on this, Barb Garrett. Both men's and women's name are written in flowing Spencerian script. 2 blocks are dedicated to my mother, but I have yet to figure out which of the women on this quilt was the daughter. But I now have newspapers.com, which I hope to find more clues from. Some of the surnames actually appear, some of the same ones appear on this next quilt. This Ballsbaugh stone, rolling stone, uses very distinct Pennsylvania German color palette of bright pinks and oranges with blue as the neutral. The large stamp names are mostly Ballsbaughs, with Alice the most likely maker in this center block. Her mother and father and uncle's blocks are above and below. Here she is, and here's her mother, my father, and here's her uncle Christian right down here. Alice hand wrote the exact date she finished the quilt after the stamped month. Her uncle Christian was a well-known fraktur artist, and the Tafshine he painted for her birth recently sold at auction. Beautiful. Christian's life was dedicated to religious writing and illustration. And here he is from his Find a Grave site. And these frakturs of his are very unusual and very inventive. So I think the man had a real gift here, because his are just not like anyone else's. There aren't a lot of them around, so it's just amazing that this one just happened to turn up when I was searching for ideas and about this quilt. Well, Barbara discussed fraktur. Yeah, fraktur quilts with this broken lettering seem to have been made only in Pennsylvania and largely in Lutheran and Reformed church families, living in counties that are both north and west of Philadelphia, but not much of any place else. There was no German word for quilt in the mid-19th century, so rug, as in bed rug, was used. So here is ear-typic. I've only seen one other quilt that has something like this, and it says her property, but all of the others say her rug. The most prolific of the inscribed quilts and Tafshines were inscribed by George Straley, who was born in Germany in 1794. He revealed his identity by inscribing his name on Christina Schultz's Rolling Stone quilt that you saw a bit earlier. And here's one of his Tafshines done in red ink, so he's very distinctive. But you can see clearly that this is the man. If you're going to find a fraktur quilt, it's most likely by this man, who of course was a professional at doing this. Well, here we have some appliqued letters in a Pennsylvania quilt. It's very rare in Pennsylvania. But Lydia, I think, probably made, and others in her family, because these are not all alike, others in her family created this top as a family record in 1856. Hearts decorate Thomas's block, her husband. Lydia married Thomas, who was a plasterer, in 1853. males born in the late 1820s to early 40s probably have some involvement in the Civil War. And Thomas, who was born in 1829, joined the 16th Pennsylvania Infantry in 1861, then the 87th Infantry for a longer stretch. The poor sod hurt himself badly by falling through a railroad bridge in 1862. And after a long stretch in the hospital, he enlisted again in the 114th Infantry and was wounded again in Virginia. All of this is in his pension record, by the way. By 1863, Lydia had 4 more children in addition to Margaret, Roselia here, and Laura. So she was trying to raise them while he was off at war. So that's probably why this top is never finished. Here we have a streaks of lightning initialed ASL 1878. And I bought this really graphic quilt from a dealer who said the family name was Leonhard, Leonard, or Leonard, something like that, he said. And that it was one of more than 30 quilts that were sold at the same estate sale. And I searched every spelling combination I could of those letters without success for years. But later I saw an auction notice in the same Franklin County community with the name Leonhard. I tracked the seller down and she gave me the entire story. The earlier auction had sold quilts made by the Lesher family members, well-known quilters in the area, especially this Alice Susan Lesher, who is listed as a dressmaker in the 1900 census. Most of the family was Mennonite. And here are 2 quilts she made later. There were 3 or 4 Irish chains that she made for other family members, cousins and all. And I saw this one later in an antique store, and I saw it later and later because it was there for at least 5 years, because I'm sure it was because of this screaming yellow that she used in this one. Most of her color choices are very bright, however, so eventually it found a buyer. This quilt stamped for Lloyd Herbine turned up in Berks County, and it's a vibrant 4-patch in a zigzag set and is stamped front and back with Lloyd C.R. Herbine, a very distinctive name, so he was not hard at all to find. By an amazing coincidence, a friend of mine was doing some dissertation research among a group of quilters at the Friedens Church where Lloyd is buried. She asked them if they knew Lloyd, and some of them did. And the head quilter said that Lloyd's wife was not a quilter, but that his mother was. So I've assigned her the title of the quilt maker here. And this last one is a Marie Webster Wreath of Roses. And it's signed here, right along here. It took me years to track down the name embroidered there because on this thing, which is really well done, I did notice that it's just whoever this woman was, she did a really good job on this thing. Her name was Ettie Brunhaus Schultz, and she should have turned up really easily in the census, but she didn't. Only way I found her was when Arlington National Cemetery records were added to find a grave. And I found that she was married to an Army general, and they had been living in Oak Park in 1833. However, in another amazing discovery, Polly Mello borrowed this quilt for an AQSG study center where Susan Price Miller showed a Marie Webster quilt very similar of the Morning Glory pattern, embroidered in a similar fashion, which was purchased from a well-known Wisconsin quilt entrepreneur, Mary McElwain, who advertised her shop's work in Chicago and its suburbs, which are only 40 miles away from Oak Park, Illinois, where Ettie lived. Her workshop employed something like almost 40 women in the midst of the Depression making quilts, mostly of Marie Webster patterns. So Ettie did not make this quilt. Susan's quilt is so similar that it's pretty clear that she just commissioned it from Mary McElwain's shop. But if without the extraordinary circumstances of finding her through Susan, I never would have known that she didn't do the work herself, that it was actually Mary McElwain. So that's my story.
Well, that's pretty cool. That plays into what we've talked about many times in the 19th century of, you know, did the lovely genteel lady make these quilts, or did she buy them from a cottage industry shop that was
Yes.
producing them? And so here you
right.
see a 20th century example of that.
Mhm.
All the more reason to use Xenia Cord's suggestion that we call these names inscribed rather than signatures, except for the extraordinary circumstance, like one you showed, Debbie, that says made by that person. Because to put such an extraordinarily well crafted name, your name in such a prominent way, when you didn't make it, is kind of
Yeah.
We need to consider those possibilities all the time. So inscribed rather than signed.
Yeah, I think that's very wise.
And also, sometimes, excuse me for interrupting, but sometimes the name on the quilt is the recipient of a gift.
Yeah.
So again, all the more reason to call it inscribed.
Or even
Exactly.
a later owner. We have some in our collection at the DAR where it's clear that the name, you know, and this is often when it's the name on the back or the initials, and you realize, okay, this is a record of a later owner because it does not line up with what we know about the quilter or the quilter in some way.
I've been working on something this week that sort of, where'd you buy that, or where'd you get that quilt? Well, my grandmother made it. No, it was made to sell on a riverboat that went down the Mississippi. And this is in the Kentucky Museum. They have 3 or 4 quilts by a woman and her church who used to sell quilts on a riverboat for charity.
That's cool. That's cool to know.
We don't know a thing about riverboats, you know, and it's really fun to think that there was a gift shop.
Yeah.
A gift shop on the riverboat. So wait, so he had a quilt and you could tell from the style of it that it was one of these riverboat quilts.
No, that's what the family said. There were 4 quilts and these were made by this woman. And it said she and her friends at the church also did the charity quilts for the riverboat. And it's something, you know, a sales item or a sales mechanism that I'd never considered. But you know, riverboats were.
Well, one thing really occurred to me when I was doing this. Find a Grave is a great resource. It doesn't cover everybody, but these signature quilts, or rather inscribed, name-inscribed quilts, you very often, in fact, more often than not, find their names in Find a Grave, and that tells me that they were people of means. They may not have been wealthy, but they were flush enough to have bought the quilts and had them and made them one way or another, and they had headstones made. So they're of a middle class origin, a lot of these. So I don't know what that says about the democratization of quilts. I guess it means that it has really gotten to a point where pretty much everybody who has some material means can make quilts and also be an active part of the community and want to be memorialized with a headstone in a graveyard.
Well, it's all not always a matter of wanting, right? I'm thinking of a trip that I took down to see the Geesben quilters, and Joe Cunningham and I took a trip and went into a cemetery, and there was a section of the cemetery where slaves had been buried, and there were no stones. There were 1 or 2 stones, but there were indentations in the ground. And it wasn't that they didn't wish to have a headstone, but
couldn't afford it.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the marginalized people, even if they could make quilts, probably aren't going to show up in that many records,
right,
including the cemetery.
That's true.
it ain't cheap.
If they were enslaved, they were
I'm-
not in the census before 1865, and you know they had no markers. I used to travel the South and take pictures of graveyards, and my favorite are the homemade markers that are concrete with marbles. 48 marbles to tell you who it is.
Yeah.
There are many not commercially made ones.
Interesting.
That was fun to do.
I just want to take this opportunity to thank the angel that sits on my shoulder when I'm doing research and pops up with just the information that I need when I need it, completely, accidentally, whatever, which sounds like is one of your favorite people too, Debbie.
Yeah.
Well, you might have angels, but you gals come to this with so much information that you recognize what's fallen into your lap.
And we live a good life and deserve angels.
Okay, I guess we better move on.
Have a good network for that. All right, so I guess I'm next and I will start sharing my screen. Now, I have to explain that I know I'm not very well lit. On my screen, I don't look too bad, but I'm told that I look a little dark, but I did a little something to my back today and I sat down on this sofa and I am not going anywhere. So my apologies. And now I'm having trouble.
Now, honey,
Yes,
just go to slideshow. Where is it? I don't see it.
I'm clicking on slideshow. There we go.
Okay.
All right. Now, the first thing I wanted to do was
There we go.
I did a little browsing while you guys were talking. I just thought I'd show 3 samplers from the DAR museum. The one on the left is deceptively large. It's actually much rather smaller compared to these others, but this just shows you a couple of samplers. This is the most basic kind on the left where you do your alphabet and your numbers, and this is how you learn to mark your sheets and towels and pillowcases and all of your linens and your husband's shirts and your children's things and your petticoats and your chemises and everything else. And then if you go on and you might make them a little bit more decorative with a pretty picture like the one in the middle in 1770, or with pictures and a Bible verse or a hymn verse or a sweet little romantic poem. So those are just a few little extra samplers going back to Barbara's discussion. And this is the book that Lynne was referring to, The Dress of the People, Everyday Fashion in 18th Century England, if you're interested. And John Stiles also wrote about threads of feeling, analyzing the little pieces of fabric that you see in clothing and in quilts in the 18th century but in these cases were used to help identify the orphans in the foundling hospital. So that was what Lynne was referring to. And listening to Debbie talk about some of those quilts, the name Christina or Christiane Laubach was on that family tree. And we have this sampler by a Christina Laubach in Chester County, and I wonder if it could possibly be the same one. Now,
they lived in Pikeland. They lived in Pikeland.
Well, we need to talk.
Yeah.
Isn't that cool? And
Yeah.
we have something made by her sister Margaretta too, but it's not online yet, so I couldn't grab that screenshot. But that's a cool connection. We'll
There's
have to
that research angel at work again.
Exactly.
Thank you, Research Angel. So my topic is, I'm saying beyond signatures, I'm looking at genealogy. And again, I was not at the meeting where this theme was discussed. And so if I'm taking it in a slightly different direction than was intended, it's because I wasn't there for the original conversation. But since I'm from the DAR Museum, the thing that occurred to me to talk about was how you can use genealogy to flesh things out. And this may be a little bit obvious for some people, but I'm just going to go through it anyway. So I'm just going to talk about some of the things you can learn from some of the sources. Obviously, we all know about ancestry.com, and then the Mormons church's site, familysearch.org, which is free and also has a lot of records digitized. And you can do obvious things of trace from I have a screenshot of one of our quilt makers there, and oh look, we've got the portrait of her, and we've got some facts about her. You can trace if it's a complete enough tree, or if you do some more looking around on the site, you can trace the line from the quilt to the donor. You can trace how they move through censuses. I'll get back to Kitty Warren in a minute. You can find out how many children she had. Of course, not every tree is complete, because sometimes people are just saying, I'm only interested in my line, and so you only get one child. But if someone's being complete, you may say, oh my God, she had 12 children. Again, no wonder she didn't finish the quilt. Or you can say, oh wow, she had 5 daughters. This quilt is from the 1850s. By the 1850s, all of those daughters would have been in their teens, and they could have been helping make the quilt, and maybe everyone was making quilts to start, you know, have those on hand for when they eventually got married. So it kind of puts you in the picture of what's going on. Or when I was doing the Ion Elegance exhibit, I was looking at Maryland and Virginia quilts, and for most of them we know the makers. And so are there any enslaved women in that household who could have been helping with the sewing or piecing perhaps, or were taking all of the boring domestic chores off the hands of the quilt makers so that they could sit around and make pretty quilts? So that's one obvious way of going. When you look at census records, this is a quilt that I did some research on, I think during lockdown. It had always said, this was made by Dr. Hornsby's wife in Louisiana. And I thought, well, gee, thanks. What's Dr. Hornsby got to do with it? You know, you couldn't give me a name. I mean, I don't care who Dr. Hornsby is. Who is his wife who made the quilt? And by the way, Virginia Viss has since repaired this quilt to put much better patches in those 2 areas of loss. So it now looks much less obvious. We just haven't had a chance to photograph it since then. But I went and looked for Dr. Hornsby in Louisiana, and fortunately Hornsby isn't too common a name. And there was a doctor in the, you know, looking at about the right time for the quilt. In the right census, I found a Hornsby who was listed as a physician, and I was able to find a connection to the donor's family. It seems to have been a gift from one family to the other at some point. And so we were able to figure out that Dr. Hornsby's wife was in fact Almira Crossgrove Hornsby. There's more information. This is online in our online database. So if you felt like it, you could go to the DAR Museum's website and do a search and learn a little bit more about it and how it might connect to the family of the donor. It did not pass down in the family, which is why, you know, there was no way we were going to figure out who it was other than locating Dr. Hornsby in the census. You can go to probate records. This is just a random image of a probate record taken from the internet because I couldn't find any of the images that I know I've saved in some folder somewhere. Sometimes you can see a whole bunch of bed quilts listed, and that can be really cool. And then if for your particular quilt maker, and then Gloria Allen, who has done many different research projects. She wrote that she was the curator of oh, now I'm blanking on the 1980s DAR first Quilts of Virginia or something like that. What was it called?
First flowerings.
First flowerings, thank you, Debbie. First flowerings, early quilts of Virginia, 1986 or 87 exhibit we did at the DAR Museum when Gloria was the curator of the quilt collection. And she was really great at looking at lots and lots of probate records throughout a long period in any given county or a series of counties, and really doing an analysis of how many quilts do you see and what kind of quilts do you see and what are their values and what kind of people are owning things. So, you know, there are people like Gloria who have taken larger scale projects of looking at probate records to see what are the patterns of quilt ownership and so on in a certain area. looking into this quilt of ours, which is patched together with remade pieces of some beautiful old crewel work bed curtains, and it's signed here with some cross stitches, Keturah Young, March 1806. And I actually was able to find a whole lot of town council records in the DAR museum, which somebody had decided to publish. And it was very useful because you had all these different names of people in her little community in Long Island. And where, you know, so often women are invisible and not in records like this. And sadly, Keturah was visible because she was constantly being discussed by the Committee for the Poor. And so they would say, okay, where are we going to send Keturah now? And so it's like, well, Keturah is going to be in the poorhouse, or Keturah is going to be fostering at her. They were farming out poor people to sort of to be fostered, or for lack of a better word, with local families. And then the town would pay the local family some money for the upkeep of this poor member, impoverished member of the community. So Keturah was actually taken in for a long time by her brother and sister-in-law, who were then paid to take care of her. Now, I just don't even know what kind of emotional story is back there. It's like, well, I'm only taking my sister if you pay me. Or was it, I adore my sister, but you know, if I can get a little help, I could use that. I really don't know. But so we'll never really know the whole emotional story behind this, but Keturah had this bed quilt and she put her name on it. And this was probably on her bed in her brother's house, I imagine. And it just gives some resonance to me because I kind of picture her wanting to claim this possession because she did not have her own house and a lot of her own possessions. So that's what ended up turning up in the town records. You never know. A volunteer, when I was getting ready to do the Eye on Elegance exhibit, well, I always have Debby and Virginia were doing lots and lots of background research on a lot of the quilts, but another person who has said she prefers not to be named publicly, so I won't, but her name was Suzanne. She got very intrigued by the Garnhart quilts and wanted to go do a lot of research on Catherine Garnhart, and she went and did research up in Frederick where Garnhart lived, and with the help of one of the genealogy research assistants at the Frederick County Historical Society, was able to figure out a more accurate assessment of where she actually lived, what her street address was, and some earlier information had turned out to be incorrect. And she was able to find fire insurance maps, which are some wonderful sources if your community had them, from the late 19th and into the early 20th century. So after the time when she was alive, but we could look at the plot of land and the house that was on that land at least just a couple of decades after she lived there. And that just kind of gave us a better sense of where she was and what she was doing and so on. You saw my first screenshot from Ancestry was about the maker of this quilt. And you can see it's got the blues and browns that are very sort of 1840s looking. That color palette is very 1840s into the 50s, but then she's got some earlier chintz appliques in the corners, and she's got one of these floral prints in the border. They were from Maryland, but in the federal land records, you can find her husband buying land in 1842 in Texas. So we know they moved to Texas in that gives us a date for when we know they moved to Texas. And he died, I believe he died, and she moved back again later on and left some of her grown children elected to stay. But this helped us say, you know what, this isn't a Maryland quilt. This is probably a Texas quilt made in Texas in the 1840s. She may have brought some of this beautiful, expensive chintz with her, because we know when people went west or moved, they would often bring sort of a fabric stash with them because they weren't totally sure what they'd be able to get when they were where they were emigrating to. I don't know, you know, I opened this up to the group to discuss later. I've always kind of thought that the blue and the brown are a lot more basic, you know, maybe there just wasn't a great selection of fabrics at the stores in Liberty County, Texas. And so she had this nice chintz for her corners, but the blue and the brown doesn't seem to go as well. I know aesthetic choices change over time, but it's always sort of seemed to me as if, you know, this is, in my mind, and I'm ready to be disabused of this notion, but in my mind, it seems extra evidence that maybe this was done in Texas, because it feels like in Maryland, she might have been able to find a wider variety of fabrics to go along with it. But in any case, the federal land records put them in Texas in the very early 1840s. I loved seeing that Barbara used this same quilt earlier for her inked inscriptions. I got really intrigued with this quilt, which we bought just a few years ago. And there's another one made by her or her daughter that's in, I believe, the Ohio Documentation Project book. And I noticed that there's a whole bunch of animals and there's some sort of rural farm scenes, but then there are these two blocks that are jokes about the train. And on the left, it says too late for the train, and you see the train chugging along in the background, and this rather rotund man is going to have trouble catching it. He's saying, hold on, but he's not going to make the train. And this lady in the early 1870s has a train on her dress, and this cheeky boy behind her has put a basket on the train, and he says, oh my, ain't it jolly ascending your goods by trains. So I thought, well, this is interesting. What's going on with her? Well, she labels in the center, she says her name, and she says exactly where she is in Ohio. So I started doing research on that community in Ohio, and it turns out, if you look into train history in this county of Ohio, I can't remember what county it is, the train was coming to her community, a little branch line, right around the time that this quilt was being made. It opened shortly before the time this quilt was being made. So this is, I don't know that this is that was the absolute impetus for the quilt, but it makes sense that she would put something, since there are other scenes of sort of farm life in here. The train would have been making a big difference in her life around now, because she and her husband were farmers, and they were just now 2 miles or so from the train line and the station. And this would have made it a whole lot easier for them to get their goods to the market in nearby Cincinnati, I believe it was. So, you know, these are little clues that if you do the research on the local history of technology and transportation, it gives you some further insight into the quilt. So that's a little bit of farther afield, but if you let the clues lead you down the rabbit hole, you may find some interesting things. Here's an example where doing the genealogy research helped assign this something to the correct person and place. This came with the family history of having belonged to, it says Molly Lothrop. You can sort of, oops, sorry, you can barely see it up here. It says Molly Lothrop, 17 something, I forget, 82 or 74 or something like that. And the donor said, oh, well, this was made by the niece of so-and-so, and I can't even remember right now. I didn't look it up. She wanted to connect it to a famous Revolutionary War general in Vermont. So this was exhibited as in the 1970s at the Wadsworth Athenaeum as a Vermont bedrug. But when you look up this woman's family history, she has no connection to this Vermont family. If you look up the family history of the famous, it was Molly Stark and General John Stark, and there's a Lothrop connection, but not the right one. And so she wanted to connect it to the Starks of Vermont, but there was no niece named Molly that this could have been made by. So I said, well, this is weird. And you go back to the bedrugs that look like this, and they're all in New London County, as Lynn has just explored in her wonderful, wonderful exhibit, and we'll put a link to this in our resources, because the virtual exhibit is still online at the Florence Griswold Museum in New London, Connecticut, at New London County, Connecticut, so this was a flowering, of this particular style of embroidered bedspread. And there's just umpteen of them that look exactly like this. Some of them are in more attractive colors and don't look like a 1970s shag rug, but like ours. But in any case, doing the family research helped assign this to the correct person who was right there sorry, I said Vermont and I meant New Hampshire. The battle was in Vermont. He was from New Hampshire. Whatever. He has nothing to do with this bed rug, so it doesn't matter. So this is now ascribed to the correct person in the correct place, and it belongs with this whole body of work that Lynn has done a whole lot of research on. So lastly, I have an example where no amount of genealogy research, no amount of looking at documents of various kinds is going to help you out and solve your mystery. This is a quilt that was given to the DAR very early in its history, maybe around 1910. Its object number is 201. In the early years, they just started with object number 1 and kept on counting. It wasn't until the 1940s that we went to the more standard method of museum numbers. And it came with the history. This was made by Ethan Allen's niece. And that's great, but Ethan Allen was one of, I don't know, 10 or 11 or 12 children. And so he had a whole lot of nieces, and his wife was one of 8 or 9 or 10 children. She had a lot of nieces. There's no clear line from the donor back to any of these people. And so we just don't know which niece may or may not have made it. The style of the quilt is plausible. It certainly could have been made in the late 18th or more likely early 19th century by someone one generation down from a Revolutionary War famous name like Ethan Allen. But at the time, this was the important thing, the connection to the Revolutionary War big name guy, and not the actual women who made it, and not the women's history. So we'll never know which of Ethan Allen's or Mrs. Ethan Allen's many nieces may have made this quilt, and that's kind of too bad. So that's an example of just not asking the right questions or collecting the right information at the time. I mean, we were interested in different things, and this is why it's good to collect as much as we can about the quilt maker whenever we can. And at the DAR, we really like to flesh out that story of who was the person who made this, where was she, when did she live, how many children did she have, you know, what was her life like, in what context of her life did she make this quilt, and was it made when she was living in the East or when she emigrated out West, or whatever we can figure out about it. So that's where I will finish my little talk, and we can start talking.
Here we are.
Oh, you're muted, Barbara.
Thank you, dear. There was a time when a woman's name was not publicized. It was considered so rude.
That's right.
And so a niece, a niece was enough, which is something we have
In
to
this
overcome.
case, in this case, it's also trying to brag about the Revolutionary War connection. And so it was more important to say this comes from Ethan Allen's family than it was to actually give her a name in the historical record.
Because even if we had her name, she wouldn't ring as true as he did.
Right.
I think, talking about the railroad there was so interesting. We are going to do a railroad thing once. I think we should do something on transportation.
Oh, that's good.
Okay. The times in which we live, boat shipping. I was talking about the river boats and train. What a remarkable change that made in
Yep.
Yeah.
in the 30s, 20s, 30s, 40s.
Yeah. Well, I can say that I appreciated your presentation, and how I'm just thinking about how we all come at this in a different way, and this today's theme kind of shows that
Yeah.
that we get a theme and then we're just on our own, and we come at it in various ways. So it's
Right. Well, and you know, we want to flesh out the lives of these women. So we always try to find out as much as we can about the person to whom it was attributed. And again, sometimes that leads to debunking. Sometimes it leads to our having that cautionary language, like it is attributed to, or according to family history, this was made by, because we can't, you know, absolutely prove it. But I like to, you know, so much of what we have is 19th century rather than 20th century. And so the pattern names are often not really as big of an issue. And so, you know, we really want to flesh out the life of the woman, since we're lucky enough to know the maker, or at least know the family in so many cases in our particular collection. So that's how I tend to approach things, because I'm trying to give the woman kind of a voice and find out more about the life of the artist.
Well said, well said. I feel a real obligation to tell women's stories through their quilts. They did not leave much. You find more and more paper trails, but they deserve to be recorded.
That's right. And this may be the only thing that you have, you know, maybe there's also a portrait or a photograph, but this may be the only way, you know, this person was there. So let's.
And I think it's so important because we tend to believe the myth, and the myths negate our lives in many ways. The happy marriage, the not working because you have a husband, you know, hundreds of myths that when we're all of the same age, when we were in our 20s and 30s, we thought, well, that's not right.
Yeah,
there's more to life.
Our lives are different. Surely we're not the first generation to come up with that. And I think it's good for me.
Yeah. Well, we have more choices than they did. And
they did. We did.
When you see a quilt like that, you see that this is the way she's expressing herself. She may have been happy in her marriage, she may not, but she obviously found pleasure in creating this object, and we can honor that.
And we have more access to information as time goes on.
And more and more.
Yeah.
And I'm always pleased. You know, I have made a living making quilts probably for 30 years, sewing. And I love doing. What a job. Lynne loves to sew too. I'm sure several of you do. Well, if you look at the history that men writes, they look at sewing for a living as torture, as some kind of slavery. What a gig sewing for a living is. You know.
Well, not if you're a 19th century seamstress.
Well, if you didn't make any money, I make money because I'm the boss, but it's still not a bad gig. And
no,
I have to say,
that's because we have more choices. And in the 19th century, making a living with your needle was one of the very, very few choices.
You had few choices.
Unless you were a very skilled dressmaker.
Laundry, if you were really bad.
Or laundry, then, you know, then being a seamstress was no fun, because you were working 10, 12 more hours a day for an absolute pittance. So
it's the pay.
Bad light.
It's the pay, and it's bad light.
And it's
and
probably
bad
time
light.
to move on to Julie.
All right.
Okay, let me share my screen, and because I came at this in a slightly different way. Let me get this up now. There we go. Now you can see it.
Yes.
I've decided to talk about one quilt that I'm in the process of trying to figure out more about. I didn't ever have the fantasy that I would find out more about who might have made it. Because you all were just talking about trying to give credit and exposure and revelation about women's lives, but this is more of a cultural thing. this is a quilt that came into my inventory in the last month or two. And so I'm in the process of trying to figure out some things about it. The first thing that I noticed, of course, was that there was no inscription, no known history at all. It came to me with literally no information except that it was sold at an auction in Pennsylvania, and I believe it was southeastern Pennsylvania. My first response to looking at it was that it sure had a lot in common with Amish quilts, and then I received from the photos, and then I received the quilt. And when I received the quilt, I noticed that there were some things that gave me pause about that. And so I'm just going to go take you with me on my little journey here of what I was looking for and looking at, and what it meant to me in the context of what I already know, having studied a lot of Amish quilts in my time. The similarities to an Amish quilt are the following. Amish quilts tend to be pieced, often in simple designs, meaning in this case, a one patch, just a square over and over again. Amish quilts typically are in solid colors with a limited palette, and that works here. The backs of Amish quilts tend to be either solid or a very quiet print, even if on the front there is no printed fabric. There are particular borders and proportions that we see among Amish quilts. Sometimes those are shared with non-Amish people, but this wide outer border with a narrow inner border in various proportions tends to be the format. And Amish quilts tend to be quilted in a non-contrasting or dark color thread. So I'm going to go through those kind of one by one and look at them in relationship to the quilt on the left, the quilt in question. So pieced quilts, often simply, and here you can see the quilt in question on the left, and on the right is a lightning streak or bricks quilt from Holmes County, Ohio. Again, both of them are one patch quilts, and they are pieced. It's very, very rare, though not impossible, to find a appliqued Amish quilt. I guess I should set the stage here and mention that I'm talking about the classic period of Amish quilts, which is from the last part of the 19th century up to about 1960 or 70 or so, when the Amish started making quilts to satisfy tourists and buyers who were not Amish. So I'm talking about the period when the Amish were making quilts for themselves within their own communities by their community standards, and not what happened later. So pieced, often simply, almost never appliqued, though we have seen it once or twice during the classic period, and solid color. So solid colors tend to be what we see in Amish quilts. The use of printed fabric was considered too worldly and gaudy for these people whose where humility and simplicity is at are cornerstones of their lives. And then I took a little closer look at the quilt in question, and I said, wait a minute, not so fast. Because at first I thought, well, it fits that, all solid colors, right? Turns out that pink inner border is a double pink printed fabric. And while it's not impossible to find such a thing on the front of an Amish quilt, it's not at all typical. You can see it a little bit even better here. And so I went on. What about the framing and proportions? This quilt that I'm looking at does fit into the typical framing and proportions. Again, there tends to be a wide outer border, a narrow inner border, and very often the binding is of a different color than the outer border. The quilt on the right happens to be a crib quilt, but blowing it up, you can see that the proportions are similar, and that is an Ohio Amish quilt on the right. So Now, let's look at the backs of some Amish quilts. The one on the left is a Lancaster County Amish quilt with what I'm calling a quiet print on the back. This was allowed, and not only allowed, but it's shows up in a great number. Sometimes we see a solid color on the back of Lancaster County Amish quilts, but it was allowed by osmosis of community standards to put a simply printed fabric on the back of a Lancaster County Amish quilt. Whereas in the Midwest, it's more typical to see a solid color on the back. And that's what we're looking at on the right, the back of a Midwest Amish quilt. So let's look at the quilt in question on the left. Let's see, which has a quiet print, and a different Lancaster County quilt on the right that has one of those quiet prints that we talked about. So my quilt and Lancaster County quilts have these quiet prints typically. Now, quilting designs. This is where it gets pretty interesting for me. These are close-ups of Lancaster County quilts. There's a limited, see if I can get you guys out of the way so I can see what I'm doing here and go back for a second. There's a limited repertoire of quilting designs in Amish quilts. There are lots of them, but they show up over and over and over again. And we see the feathered wreath or feathers. We see the crosshatch. We occasionally see baskets or grapes in Lancaster County quilts. Again, I'm trying to figure out where my quilt in question is from and what its cultural background might be. So in Lancaster, what I want to look at here is this crosshatching. We see it a lot in Lancaster County Amish quilts, and the quilt on the right, I'm very blown it up a lot, so it's kind of not the greatest photo, but you can see that these dark or non-contrasting color threads are making crosshatches, in this case through squares that are set straight. That's a Midwestern quilt on the right, a Lancaster quilt on the left. The quilt in question, quilted in dark thread or a non-contrasting color thread, but quilted in what my friend calls a ravioli, a ravioli type of quilting, where it is crosshatch, but it's double crosshatch. And as common as and as logical as it may be to do that, it's rarely seen. In fact, when I started putting this presentation together, I couldn't think of a single other Amish quilt beside the one that that we're talking about that had this double crosshatch. And then as I went further and started looking at more and more photographs, what did I find? Yep. What did I find? I found a Mifflin County, Pennsylvania quilt that has not only a double crosshatch, but a triple crosshatch. So that opens up another possibility, which is that the quilt in question might be from a different community in Pennsylvania, that of Mifflin County, which is has quite different characteristics than the Lancaster County quilts and shares more characteristics in some ways with Midwestern quilts. So every time I think I'm getting somewhere, I find something that may be the exception to the rule. But what I will do from here, and again, I'm bringing you in on the process here. I'm not finished here. I have lots more I want to look at. And one of the things I'm going to do is go look at a large collection of Mifflin County quilts, which is in the collection of the International Quilt Museum in Nebraska. Someone gave them a bunch of Mifflin County quilts. And what I'm going to do next is go look at those and see if I can find similar quilting designs to this double and triple crosshatch. Another thing I'm going to do, which I haven't had time to do yet, is look at Pepper Corey's book, which was published in 1986. It's called Quilting Designs from the Amish. And I didn't have time before I got this thing together to go look at it, but that's going to be a resource for me to find out if she refers to the double crosshatch or triple crosshatch. When I first got the quilt, I thought, well, it has rounded corners, and I don't think Amish quilts very frequently have rounded corners. And so I started looking, and here's a bunch of both Lancaster and Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and Midwestern quilts, and none of them, as you can see, have rounded corners. And I didn't remember until I started looking through my photos of all the Amish quilts that I've either owned or sold or taken care of at the Esprit collection. And what did I find? I found an Ohio Amish quilt that was in the Esprit collection, 1940-ish, baby's blocks, that has rounded corners. And then I found two crib quilts or trundle bed quilts, also from the Midwest, both of them from the Midwest, and they have rounded corners. And then I thought, well, let's go to somebody who really knows what they're talking about, the current expert on Amish quilts, the wonderful Janniken Smucker, who has written several books and done a lot of study of Amish quilts. And I decided that I would just contact her and find out what she thought, sent her a bunch of pictures of the quilt in question, and got this wonderful response, which says, Julie, your quilt is indeed a tough one. As you know, I'm pretty hesitant to ever say anything definitive, but my best guess would be some branch of conservative Mennonite in southeastern Pennsylvania, which I had mentioned before is where I bought the quilt with no other information. She says it's pretty rare to see a Pennsylvania quilt with a print on the top side, although that on the back is fairly characteristic of Amish quilts in Lancaster. So printed fabric on the back of Lancaster quilts, and not common to find printed on the back of Midwestern Amish. Those double pinks appear in many Pennsylvania Mennonite quilts, and the rounded corners feel more Mennonite than Amish. Most Amish quilts with rounded corners are late century, 19th century, and are late 19th century and Midwestern. The quilting does not look like Pennsylvania Amish, although you maybe could make the case for it being Midwestern. And then she says, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but I'm confirming that it is indeed a challenging one. So I'm going to continue onward and forward, as my mother would say often, doing more research on this quilt, which is behind me, by the way. I'm in my shop and it's on the rack behind me. It's a wonderful quilt. And I think that I am with Janniken on this, that it's probably Mennonite and probably Pennsylvania. And there are people in this group who may know a lot more about this even than I do. So let's turn it over to you guys. And I'm thinking Debbie might have some ideas about this.
Oh, no, you all, you and Barb Garrett are the ones who, and Janniken are the ones that know about these Amish quilts. But I have seen Mennonite quilts that are similar to this in Pennsylvania for sure. So it wouldn't surprise me if you come down on the side that it's Mennonite.
Yeah, I'm calling it old order Mennonite and possibly old order Mennonite and found in southeastern Pennsylvania. So that's the information I will give to the buyer. And
that sort of makes sense because, I mean, at the risk of trivializing it, and I don't mean to be flippant, I mean, Mennonite is sort of Amish adjacent, isn't it? It's sort of Amish light. It's similarly conservative. I really don't mean that disrespectfully. I just don't know how else to sort of explain it in a quick phrase. Well, that you know, they're a little bit more, they're conservative and traditional, etc., but they're a little bit less strict in a lot of ways. They're allowed to.
In a nutshell, the Amish broke off from the Mennonite, the larger Mennonites, with a man named Jacob Ammon. But and Mennonites have a much broader range of orthodoxy. So there are Mennonites walking around. You're not going to see an Amish person walking around who you wouldn't recognize as Amish. They're going to be in
Yeah.
a costume. Mennonites, on the other hand, one of us might be Mennonite. I don't think we are. But so there are old order Mennonites where the quilts do look more like Amish quilts, which is why we're attributing it there. But there are Mennonites whose quilts and everything else about them are undifferentiated visually or in any material way like that. It's a wide range.
Julie, why don't you stop your screen share?
That's a very good idea, Barbara. Thank you.
You know, I am not Mennonite, but I had a Mennonite mother-in-law for 20 years. And you wouldn't know she was a Mennonite from looking at her. She went to the Quaker church because her husband did. But there's such a range from some of her relatives, very conservative, living on the farm still, to people like her who lived in Wichita. She taught at a grade school, so she was definitely out there. But she always emphasized to me that there was a wide range.
And there's also the idea that very often Amish people married Mennonite people, and or moved from one Amish community to another, so that they might be bringing the old style with them into a community that had slightly differing standards. And this might have been an Amish woman who married into Mennonites. Or I mean, we don't know. I don't think I have a chance on this one of getting the actual woman. There's just no possibility. But I thought to talk about the cultural.
But Julie, that's a really great case study in how you take a piece apart, the pieces of all the different little clues that you can look at, that the binding, the colors, the use of fabrics, the use of the back, the proportions, which are important, the quilting designs, just all of those intrinsic clues in the design are important features. And you laid it out so beautifully that there are very different trends in this region, that region, this group, that group. So that was just a master class in how to use some of those clues, similar to what we were trying to get at, but we were sort of all over the place in the Quilt Alliance chat, which I really enjoyed, but we were trying to cover a lot of ground. So I think, we weren't able to get into as much detail, but that is a really good example of where you can go when you don't have any specific information or a name.
Yeah, and in this case, I had two expert people, being Pepper Corey, who's done so much work on Amish quilting, and Yanniken, who has done just the whole range of things. And then my own experience of 40 or 45 years looking at
absolutely. And you have a huge file of images to look through, so you have a really good data set.
But I think I just want to take a minute here to say that there are more general, is this backwards or not?
No, it looks good to us.
It's forwards.
Oh,
what an interesting book.
What an interesting book by Barbara Brackman. That is
what a smart person wrote that book.
And it's the table of contents tells you everything. Chapter 3, clues in fiber and fabrics. Chapter 4, clues in color and dyes. Chapter 5, clues in cotton prints. Chapter 6, clues in techniques. Chapter 7, clues in style. 8, clues in patterns. This is
I don't pay these.
Indispensable book that will help you just get it, you guys.
Well, it's still in print, sort of, print is the.
And then for identifying patterns, I mean, here we go. Barbara's in its third printing, which can't be beat if what you're looking for is how to name a pattern. And many, many other books by wonderful authors.
Well, those are two of my desert island discs.
Yeah.
If
I
I had
to fabric there.
Yeah. If I had to pack, pack for life on a desert island, those would be two of the books I'd take along.
Yeah.
For research.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. No, I just having that background in psychology, and in 1979 when I wrote that book, thinking, well, this could use sort of a scientific approach to the whole thing.
Yeah.
What impelled me.
I
Very
was telling-
systematic.
I was telling Barbara not long ago, she doesn't remember this, but in
I
my
haven't
early
remembered
days
that.
of lecturing, I was giving a workshop, and I still give a workshop on dating quilts. And I used so much of her book to get myself together for that workshop that I was giving, that I sent her half my fee.
See, I tell you, you can make money sewing if you make your friends feel guilty. Right. Right.
Yeah.
Well, this has been really fun. And I think it's interesting how we all come to that. The whole idea of the information that is given you, just a tiny little bit of information, and then we expand
You
upon
can
it.
run with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
hope you guys are inspired to do it too.
Yeah. And share your quilts with us on the Show Us Your Quilts Facebook page.
Yeah.
Know-it-alls, show us your quilts.
Well, look at some Mennonite quilts, Julian. See what we can-
But I thought it was intriguing to go look at Mifflin County quilts, and what a resource, right? That the museum happens to
That's
have
great.
given
Yeah.
50 or 60 examples, so that that's what I'm going to do as soon as I leave you guys. I'm going to go find out if Mifflin County did this.
That's cool. Get back to us on that.
Yeah. And don't forget my mother-in-law, the Kansas Mennonite, was from
Right.
Ohio, but she moved to Kansas pretty young. There are tons of Kansas Mennonite quilts.
Uh-huh.
Mm.
Some Kansas Amish, but mostly Kansas Mennonite.
Yeah,
And we don't even think about them because nobody's documented them very well.
right, right.
Mhm.
Well,
I hesitate to ask this question because we've now been talking for 2 hours.
Oh, no.
But maybe we can bring this up on the Facebook page. But I grew up in an area of Montana with a lot of Hutterites.
hmm.
And so I'm just wondering if there's a Hutterite quilt tradition. But let's take that up on the Facebook page so I
Well,
can go
that's-
and eat dinner.
Well, but that's
Yeah.
an excellent point, because what we know is that hundreds of groups came from Pennsylvania to America, and not many of them survived. The Amish have survived. It's we think because they're so flexible that they were able to they weren't so strict. Just to give a really quick example, there are many Amish don't use electricity, not to not be modern, but to not yoke them to others. It's seen as a way of being
Oh,
yoked.
really?
But many Amish will put an extension cord to their neighbor's electricity and use it on their farm and think that they're still within the rules, which is what I'm saying is they were so much more flexible that they
Interesting.
have survived. That it is a whole other, but there are many, many groups, and there are still some, the Schwenkenfelders, what's the one that Anita Schorsch was writing about that starts with M?
Moravian?
The Moravians, yeah.
Moravians.
And in Kansas, we have
Coming over from
Dunkards.
Germany.
And the
Yeah.
Dunkards, right. It's a
Dunkards.
very good point, Lynn, and we will talk about it at some point.
All right, that would be a topic.
All that to say that we're on every month, the second Wednesday.
Right.
Never know what you're going to hear when you tune in.
And
to the
neither do
know-how.
we. Bye-bye, everybody.
It's been
Bye.
great.
Thanks for listening.
Glad to be back after an absence.
He was in Europe.
See y'all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Did you know you can watch our previous episodes on Vimeo? Vimeo.com/quiltdistrict/VOD_pages. Or you can search for the 6 know-it-alls when you go to the main page of Vimeo.com. You can also catch our first 3 episodes, which are free, on our YouTube channel. You can go directly to our YouTube channel, or you can go to youtube.com and search for the 6 know-it-alls. You can also find all the updates and links to previous episodes on quiltdistrict.com. Go to quiltdistrict.com and then the 6 Know-It-Alls tab. And there you'll find all the upcoming episode information, as well as the background on how the 6 Know-It-Alls got started and some biography information on all of the Know-It-Alls. You'll also want to be sure you put your email address in here so that you can get notified of upcoming events straight to your email inbox.
And I'm harping on this because lighting is so important to understanding the seasonal rhythms of quilting in this early period and why it began to change in the 19th century.
But that's not the way we use it, just to stick it in there. And so often you will find some turkey red pieces just put in there for a little flair. Even this one has a little bit of red down there, although that's a wool.
This is one quilt that I wanted to talk about today because we just were able to add it to the collection last year. Yeah, it was on loan for many years from the family. And some of you know the quilt maker Anna Catherine, known as Catherine Hummel Markey Garnhart of Frederick, Maryland. And thanks to my predecessor, Nancy Gibson, we now know of 10 quilts made by Markey Garnhart. And we now own 3.
Yeah.
That's
Yes.
interesting.
And that is very interesting that it's made for the wife of the minister. And I have never heard of the lady sewing group being called a circle of industry. So that's quite interesting. I wonder if it's belongs to that denomination, if there are others that call themselves something similar.
So I just wanted to show how the designs of these bed rugs relate to whole cloth quilt and other types of quilts. So here we have one of the foot bed rugs, and here we have a whole cloth quilt that was made by Olive Curtis Baker in Connecticut. And the stitching of this whole cloth quilt is basically pretty much the same idea as you see in the bed rug.
The other thing is, and this goes back to Lynne too with the bed rugs. If we were looking at men's work, if we were looking at ceramics like graffiti plates or painted chests, we wouldn't be thinking of it as a hobby.